Good evening. My name is Vikas, and as the pandemic has extended our stay at home and we are in lockdown, I've taken the opportunity to use platforms like this to bring on guest speakers to the T4 Facebook group, to the LinkedIn group, on YouTube, then on Twitter. And we've had some really great conversations actually with people that I'm told that you found interesting. And it's in that regard that I was trying to think about, well, who has been really interesting that I've come across in the past that I'd love to get them on. And our speaker today, or our guest interviewee today, firmly falls in that bracket where I met Richard Watson, who is our guest today, about a decade ago, if I'm not mistaken, where I was looking for someone who's a futurologist. And he came to speak at a closed conference, and he kind of blew me away. And so since then, we've stayed in touch intermittently, and he's always updated us through his media profile in terms of what his thoughts are. The question I had, and I welcome you, Richard, to this conversation. Welcome to this live stream, Richard. For everyone's sake, what is a futurologist? Let's just make that clear.
I don't actually know. I guess it's somebody that thinks about the distant future. I mean, most people use the term futurist, which is technically incorrect because that can get confused with an art movement in the early 1900s. But everyone loves to shorten things, so it's become futurist rather than futurologist. But yeah, generally it is people that are thinking about the distant future. Usually writing about it. I mean, you're not much of a futurologist if you just think about it and don't tell anybody. So you really need to sort of get your thoughts on paper or on television or some other sort of format. It obviously bashes into science fiction at some point, although science fiction, I think, is definitely in, well, not always, but it's usually in the realms of fantasy. This is a bit more possible, what people are talking about. And I guess, I mean, my sort of time frame is generally 5 to 15 years, and the most I would ever go out would be about 40. Whereas, I mean, I have a very good friend, Lavi Tidar, who's a science fiction writer. He generally thinks in terms of 200 years plus. So there's quite a difference.
And I assume that futurists, forgive the spelling on here. Futurists, I mean, they don't normally hang around to see what they are predicting actually comes true. But in your case, if you're just doing a timeline that's 5 to 15 years, there's a good chance that you're going to bump into some of your predictions, right? And so,
yeah, I mean, that's one of the quite fun things. Is I wrote my first book in 2006, so you can go back and see what I was thinking then, and there's a sort of level of accountability. Although I generally say what a lot of futurologists say, which is, I'm not really there. Well, my excuse is I'm not really there to make predictions as such about the future. I'm there to articulate different visions about what it might look like. And actually, a lot of the time, I'm actually using the future as a bit of an excuse to get people to think more deeply about the present.
No, that's so. Tell me, Richard. I mean, what have you got right? I mean, I'm not saying it from a position that I'm trying to out you in any way. But you talk about in 2006 you wrote your first book. Tell us in terms of what have things panned out as what you thought they would.
Well, I haven't properly read it since I wrote it. In fact, I don't really think I've ever read a book once I finished writing it and doing the proofreading and so on. I did start reading this first book, Future Files, about 5 years ago with the aim of almost sort of marking myself. And I was going to write a book as a sort of follow-up. It occurred to me it was becoming quite boring, but it was also quite self-indulgent. And also the book was about the year 2050. So we're a way off that yet. So, there's this great futurist excuse, which is, give it time. So it's a bit too early to say. However, there were some things that did appear to be right. I mean, in 2006, it came out in 2007. I was concerned about, I didn't use the term subprime, but I was concerned about the level of debt in older and poorer households, particularly in the US. And I said something about an avalanche waiting to descend, which it promptly did about a year later, which worked marvels for the sales of the book. More recently, the pandemic. I mean, I've had a pandemic in 4 out of 5 books. It featured very strongly on a risk radar I did in 2015 that came out of some government workshops on extreme risk. So, that would be a big tick. One thing I haven't got right yet, but it's tracking quite well in my opinion, is I've always thought the EU would splinter and ultimately fall to pieces. I'm surprised by how well it's held up in the pandemic, although we've yet to get to the sort of the financial aftermath of this. So, we'll see how that holds together. And there was some stuff I got hilariously wrong. I mean, I was making a semi-serious point back in 2006 about plastic surgery and how authenticity or realness was becoming quite a thing. And I made a sort of semi-serious comment about women regarding facial lines as highly desirable, which I am laughed at to this day.
So, I mean, I remember the thing that really got my attention was this London tube map kind of infographic or poster that you created on megatrends and technologies, right? And you'd actually allowed it under Commons license to anyone who wants to blow it up, and I did blow it up actually, Richard, because I thought it was so wild in what you were saying that I thought it had some shock factor, some awe factor in that sense. And so I've got your latest iteration open on my screen. I want to read some of this out to those that are watching. And so you predict, for example, in the shape of a London tube map, I wish I could have shown you, is, for example, you talk about the full merger between humans and machines, lifelong virtual companions, robots giving birth to children. You talk about privatization of public spaces, brain-machine interfaces, emotionally aware machines, weaponization of finance, and you've got so much of this kind of, I see another one, sperm-free reproduction, and you just think some of this is nuts. And so I remember the point you made when we first met was you're willing to stand by each and every single one of these bullets and say, no, there's evidence behind it. There's people have talked about it. Is that still the case?
Pretty much. I mean, I did a table with Imperial College recently on 100 disruptive technologies. And I would stand by every single one. Actually, there's 99 and a good joke, but I would stand by every single one of them. And most of this stuff, particularly in the case of the disruptive technologies, this is not stuff we're waiting to be invented. It already exists. It just doesn't work very well, or it's quite rare. And the table was about ubiquity, common usage rather than invention. But yeah, I don't really just conjure stuff out of nowhere. That I do leave for the science fiction writers.
And I remember at that time, the point you were making was that you read the Economist magazine page to page. And I still remember this because I used to read the Economist, but I was obviously reading the wrong articles. And so you were saying that, like, if you just take that as a source, you can absolutely try to figure out what people are saying and what's going on. And a lot of the evidence with what's on this map comes from periodicals or quality media reporting like that. Is that the case?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I've given up reading newspapers these days, or at least I don't read them when they come out. I've given up daily newspapers. I read the only ones I read now are the Financial Times at the weekend and the New York Times at the weekend. But I've developed this trick which I call retrospective reading, where I read them when they're about a week old or even a month old, which I find I get less cross. I'm in a calmer frame of mind. You can skim them a lot quicker because a lot of things that people are becoming hysterical about just haven't happened in that period. And you can see connections much more easily. And there's the key thing about weekend newspapers is people have got more time to write them. They're slightly more analytical, and also people have got more time to read them at the weekend. The Economist is still a good one. And again, you need to read all of it because it's about cross-fertilization. If you haven't got time to read The Economist, the thing they do every year, which is the year in review, is a lovely summary. I don't read that much in terms of magazines, periodicals anymore. I mean, the Economist is still a strong one. New Scientist is a strong one. Foreign Affairs for a bit of a sort of geopolitical spice. I'm currently addicted to TLS, Times Literary Supplement, largely because of book reviews. But I don't read a vast amount. There's a few things I like online. Eon, brain pickings, but I've shifted more to sort of periodicals and especially books, because I think they're a bit more rigorous.
And so some of our viewers are actually asking questions, all right? And I would love for you to like weigh in and give a take on it, right? So Branka, for example, says she's from the Balkans, saying, will we be happy in the future? This is not an agony answer.
That's up to us. Funny if I've just written a post which I'm going to stick on LinkedIn tomorrow on 10 reasons to be cheerful, because there's obviously an awful lot of gloom and doom around at the moment. But the fact of the matter is, if you sort of put last year and the beginning of this year to one side, I would argue it's never really been a better time to be alive. I mean, you look at everything from how long you'll probably live, infant mortality, the number of women in work and education, clean water, death from wars and conflicts. You know, it's a lot better than it was 100 years ago or 200 years ago. I mean, happiness is a tricky one. I mean, there's more and more interest in that. I think Bhutan now has a happiness index, and I think measuring, I mean, they're not measuring happiness with traditional GDP figures, but it's a very blunt instrument, GDP, and economic measures generally aren't terribly useful, I think. I mean, my personal view is it's not something you can just sort of suddenly get, and it generally comes, in my experience, from helping other people, actually, and wanting less rather than more. But ultimately, it's like the future generally. I mean, you know, we get the future we deserve, in the sense that the future is created by what you and I decide to do tomorrow and the day after and thereafter. You know, there are elements of the future we can't control, without a doubt, but it is very largely made up of the decisions individuals make.
And so, again, I want to go to another question, and we'll come back to this point, actually, because it's quite fascinating. What she's meaning to ask is, will AI replace us?
Okay, that I have spent quite a lot of time thinking about. I wrote a book 2-3 years ago called Digital versus Human, which is exactly looking at that alongside robotics, automation, screens, and so on. Well, again, the sort of slightly flippant answer is, if we decide we want it to. I mean, at the moment, we are in charge of AI. I mean, we should make a very significant distinction between what we've got right now and we've had for years, which is narrow AI, you know, a machine that can do one thing very well, and a sort of broader or more general or deeper AI, where a machine is as smart as humans across the board. And my view is we are nowhere near that at the moment. I doubt whether I'll see that in my lifetime. I mean, we might. And even if we do, there are still going to be things that machines won't be able to do. Top of the list will probably be dealing with people, managing, leading, inspiring people. I really struggle to see machines doing that. Creativity, I'm kind of sitting on the fence about. I mean, a lot of people cite that as the one thing machines can't do, but there's plenty of examples of machines being extraordinarily creative already. But ultimately, again, it's our decision. I mean, it is possible, obviously, that some sort of spontaneous sentence comes out of these machines and they suddenly wake up and take over. But I regard that as somewhat unlikely. And I don't think we should be scared by AI. I mean, we will work alongside AI. AI is extraordinarily good at the things we're extraordinarily bad at, and vice versa. So it's a nice little bit of teamwork going on there with a bit of luck.
But do you not, I mean, if I just take this conversation a little bit further, and this is not necessarily about AI, but for example, on your map, you're talking about human brain interfaces, right? And so there's been a whole movement in America for decades, actually, about this. And a huge kind of fan base for that kind of conversation about how you can upload your brain, like, you know, and do these kinds of things. Do you not think that it is dangerous for humanity?
I mean, brain-computer interfaces are already a thing. This is essentially telepathy. I mean, this is controlling a machine purely by thinking about it. And we've had that for a decade or maybe even two, in the sense of we've got thought-controlled wheelchairs, we've got thought-controlled computers. The slight problem with them at the moment is you can't control them with your mind unless you stick electrodes into your brain, which is a tiny bit inconvenient, really, isn't it? But there may be a day when we stick a hat on and we can control the machine. I am a bit worried about that. I mean, there is a level of AI that concerns me. It is potentially a very dangerous piece of technology. Brain-computer interfaces, and this is where futurology does intersect with science fiction quite nicely. That could be the end of mental privacy. You can actually work out what somebody's thinking, although the cynics watching would say, well, Facebook can do that already. They can work out what you're thinking simply by what you click on and where you go online and all of those sort of things. And they slightly got a point, actually. But yeah, that is a concern. I mean, maybe, and again, it gets a bit sci-fi, maybe our destiny is to merge with machines. I mean, there is a real problem at the moment in that there are a handful of technologies which, if not exactly exponential, are getting quite close to it. They are growing very, very rapidly in terms of capability. But we're stuck with brains that from the Paleolithic period. You know, there's a great quote which I use in Digital versus Human from E.O. Wilson, I think it is, American evolutionary biologist, who says, if I can remember it, we've got the brains of the Paleolithic, the institutions of the medieval, and the technology of the gods. And he's not being complimentary. That's a problem because, you know, computing AI can fly off somewhere and we're still stuck with our standard brains. And there's a real issue looming there potentially.
And so Kirsten says thought control tech to support people with disabilities is incredible, though, right? Yep. Bushra, who, if I'm not mistaken, is in Pakistan or in Dubai, saying, I was thinking so strongly on these options, really needing Mr. Watson's advice. One, developing our lost connection with nature, and number two, embracing this influx of new technologies. Do you want to take a crack at the nature point?
Yeah, I think one of the good things, I mean, this pandemic's been dreadful, but there have been some good things have come out of it so far, at least. We may go backwards at some point, but I mean, first of all, we seem to sort of rediscover local community. Compassion and empathy sort of came back. And in what I refer to as sort of lockdown 1 in the UK, which I guess was sort of March, April 2020, essentially nothing moved. And you could hear the birds for the first time. And you know, I'm a crazy passionate gardener. And without my garden, I would have slightly gone crazy, I think. I get tremendous pleasure out of nature, and the older I get, the more pleasure I get out of it. And it's you know, it's that old quote that, you know, the world in a grain of sand, but it's also the world in a leaf and a caterpillar. And you know, I suppose the other thing that might possibly come out of the pandemic is more emphasis on sustainability and climate change. I mean, that looks like where a lot of the investment will go. And there is a realization slightly that we have been trashing the planet, and it's a little bit finite, and we should look after it better. So I'm sort of optimistic that we will appreciate nature more. I mean, rewilding is becoming a thing. You know, planting trees is becoming quite a sexy thing to get involved with, and great.
Richard, we should, I suppose, talk about education slightly, given that the audience for this are teachers and educators from around the world, and you know, the question that we often get asked, and I know you've written about and you've commented on, is what is the future of education, right? And so I ask a very large question to you, and please try to address it in whichever way you wish to take it on with. And then there'll be follow-up questions that I'm sure will come up with regards to the questions. But what do you think the future of education is?
I think the answer lies in the past to some extent. I'm not. I mean, I should point out that my mother was a teacher. I've got 2 kids growing up with 2 different educational systems, England and Australia. I'm probably more passionate about education than anything else. And I think we're doing it really badly in most places. I mean, first of all, the obsession with technology and physical facilities over and above teachers. I mean, people are the most important thing, always have been, always will be. You really can't, I mean, you can replace teachers, and having an online education is better than no education. So if you're in the middle of nowhere, I have no issue whatsoever with an online education. But it should supplement physical presence of teachers, not eradicate the physical presence of teachers. In early years, socialization is extraordinarily important. And I think, you know, what we're lacking is enough good teachers. And I might personally, my sort of recipe for solving the issues with education is to pay teachers twice as much money. And I think we would get more teachers and we would get better teachers. At the moment, the fixation is ed tech. I think it was Steve Jobs who said that, you know, what's wrong with education cannot be fixed by technology, of all people. But I would agree with that. You can see I get quite thingy about this. I can only really talk about the UK and Australia. I don't know about education in other places, but particularly in the UK, we're obsessed with exams, which measure one form of intelligence, of which there are many. So it's focused on IQ rather than EQ, and EQ is incredibly important. I mean, you talk to employers, and what they're after is, you know, really curious, passionate, energetic, personable people, almost beyond anything else to some extent. And people that have taken some knocks as well would help. Schools have become obsessed with teaching pupils to pass tests. They've become obsessed with rankings. And this is quite concerning. I mean, there's little or no consideration to ethics. I mean, you can be a sort of an A-star student in the UK and a psychopath, and it's not really a problem, actually. As long as you pass your exams, that's fine. And the pressure on kids to perform on a certain day or a series of days is just immense. I prefer more measurement over time, over sort of coursework. Rather, I mean, I'm not suggesting you get rid of exams, but the focus there's an imbalance in terms of the focus. And I do think we need to focus more on sort of the EQ side of things. I mean, my biggest point to some extent looking forward is about AI, though. In the UK, and I'm being sort of generalist here, we are more or less teaching children to compete head on with AI. And, you know, I'm not saying you don't teach maths or science or STEM, of course you teach that, but that is the beginning, not the end. We should be focusing more on what AI either can't do at all, and there's not too much of that, but things that AI is really poor at, and there's quite a lot of that sort of stuff. So again, it's sort of empathy, compassion, dealing with people, intuition, creativity is a big one. All of those kinds of things as a sort of supplement, if you like.
So you answered this question that this Facebook user is asking, which is, what are the habits that kids must have? And you answer that. But tell us, in terms of, Richard, I think your comments are related to the schooling system and schooling sector. What about universities? I mean, you're associated with Imperial and Cambridge, and you've done things at the London Business School. What is your take on the future of universities?
They're a little bit more complicated, and I don't have a coherent view on it at the moment. I mean, I'm concerned with universities taking too many foreign students. I think there's a sort of concentration risk there. And potentially you are pushing out domestic students. And again, I'm not arguing that you stop having foreign students. Don't be ridiculous, but just there should be a balance there. And there should be, you know, I'm a big fan of diversity in every possible sense. So let's have some diversity in terms of nationalities and so on. There is an issue with certain nationalities becoming sort of quite cliquey and not talking to anybody else, which is a problem. Again, you have the test issues. I mean, I'm much more relaxed with technology, the use of technology in universities, I think, because once you've got to that stage, you know, it's slightly different. I'm a big fan of, I can't remember what it's called, but it's essentially problem-based degrees. So you would instead of doing a degree in biology or physics or something, you might do a degree in malaria. You know, you look at the problem and you come up with ways of solving the problem, and it would probably be multidisciplinary. And I think that's a really interesting idea. I like the thought of slow education generally, and this is not just about universities, obviously, it's education across the board. I don't really understand why we're in such a rush these days to educate people. I think they should go into school and university later and stay there longer. I mean, you know, I think there's a statistic in my head that in the UK, if you are born as a girl to a middle-class family, there's a 50% chance you will see your 100th birthday. But we have an education model that was largely based on 100, 200 years ago when people were lucky to see their 40th birthday. So let's just sort of chill out a bit and take our time a bit and be a little bit more meandering. Let's sort of instill sort of passion and curiosity. I mean, beyond that, it's tricky. I mean, I'm worried about the cost of it. I'm not sure that's sustainable. I mean, my own son was up at Leeds in the north of England, and he quit after a term because he was paying £9,000 a term. This was during the pandemic, so it was exceptional, but he was paying £9,000 a year, essentially to stare at a computer 3 times a week. I mean, I'm sorry, but that's not value for money. We've got to sort of look at other ways of doing it, and maybe online is a way of radically bringing that cost down. Maybe there could be, you dip in and out, it becomes more part-time, you don't do it in solid blocks. There's a massive opportunity with sort of people when they retire to go back to university. And I think University of the Third Age is already addressing that, but I think we could do more with that.
Your map talks about something called just-in-time learning. Do you want to speak a little bit about that?
Well, we've sort of got that. It's called Google. Once upon a time we had to, the problem with early years education is we're supposed to sort of be these memory machines, and we cram our heads with facts, so-called facts, and we spew them out on a series of set days. I don't know what my view is on this, but the question is, do we need to know the date of the Spanish Armada when I can find out in a second? Do I really need to know that? What I probably need to know more about are the reasons for the Spanish Armada and the consequences. That's something that I could spend more time on. But simply spewing out dates or something, I'm not sure we really need to know that. And my younger son, who's 18, he does this. When he has a problem with something, and he had a problem with a car earlier today, I'm afraid he doesn't ask me, which is what I'd like him to do. He Googles it. Although interestingly, he doesn't go to Wikipedia. He goes to YouTube. He wants to see a video of somebody solving the problem. And that's not a replacement for education in any shape or form, but it's an interesting development.
And so again, on your map, you talk about an epidemic of study drugs. Say a little bit more about that. Yeah,
this is not that well known about. It's becoming quite a problem in the UK and possibly the US. I don't know about elsewhere. These are essentially drugs that treat autism in various aspects. So they create focus and attention. And they're incredibly useful if you want to learn something really boring. So legally and mainly illegally, a lot of students, and I guess I'm talking sort of 18 to 21-year-olds, are taking drugs to help them to pass exams, which one assumes would then potentially make their way into the workforce. So you've got drugs to help them do their jobs. This is quite well known about. If you read the Guardian newspaper in the UK, they've reported on this quite extensively, but it's not sort of common knowledge, shall we say.
Wow. Well, you've certainly given us a lot to think about, and I know from the comments that we're getting that you have certainly shaken the tree a little bit in terms of making us think about what the future of education could be, given your work and your research. Richard, I'm led to believe that these interviews are best at 20-minute segments, and I know that we're over that. And so I hope that you'll come back later on in this year, and we can have another chat on post-pandemic, what the future looks like and what the new norm is. Because I figure that we're in this period of transition where there's a shift happening. And so I'd love to speak to you in detail about what is it that we've learned during the pandemic that has a huge impact on the future. Exactly what you said about nature as an example, and us reconnecting with it, or understanding that physical spaces in schools, or rather the physical infrastructure is as important as the online learning piece because of the human and social connection that you make. So I'd love to get you back on later on this year, and I want to thank you for this opportunity. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Vikas.